Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics at Iowa State University. And I'm pleased to welcome you tonight to tonight's presentation by the 2006 Spring Mary Louise Smith Chair in Women in Politics, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend. Tonight's presentation is sponsored by the Carrie Chapman Catt Center and also by the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by GSB. Before we introduce tonight's speaker, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Mary Louise Smith, for whom the chair is named. And it was established in her honor at Iowa State in 1995. An Iowa native and a longtime political and social activist, Mary Louise Smith was the first and only woman to chair the Republican National Party. She was a mentor, friend, and role model to many in the world of politics and civic and government service. The purpose of the chair is to bring nationally renowned political leaders, scholars, and activists to Iowa State University to enrich the experiences of our students and to educate citizens about the role of women in the political process. Following in the footsteps of Mary Louise, the chair serves as an inspiration and role model for students, as well as members of the university and Iowa communities. We believe that Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, with her rich history of political leadership, carries out the legacy of Mary Louise Smith. We are looking forward to her thoughts that she'll be telling us tonight on gender and executive leadership as we approach the 2006 election, in which there are now 16 women in 14 states running for governor, and the 2008 presidential election, where we may have a woman, or maybe two, on the presidential tickets. Now, to tell you a little bit about tonight's speaker, please welcome Iowa State University President Gregory Joffre.
Thanks very much, Diane, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening for the Mary Louise Smith Spring Lecture. And a very special thanks to the Honorable Kathleen Kennedy Townsend for agreeing to hold the chair and be our lecturer this evening. I had the very good fortune of getting to know then Lieutenant Governor Townsend when we both worked together in Maryland. But unfortunately, I left Maryland before the 2002 election, and I did not have the opportunity to vote for her when she ran for governor. I can assure you that I would have, because of her very, very strong support for education at all levels, unlike her opponent. The Mary Louise Smith lecture has become one of the highlights of our spring lecture series for the reasons that Diane mentioned, but also building on this great tradition of Mary Louise Smith. I want to thank the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for sponsoring the lecture, Diane Bystrom for her terrific leadership of the center, but most important for the work of everyone involved in the center in encouraging young women to become active in government and politics. I now have the very special opportunity to introduce to you Marissa Stallman, who will introduce our speaker. Marissa is a junior majoring in political science and journalism, and she is co-president of the Catt Associates student organization. Marissa.
When discussion of the first woman president often emerges, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend is a name that is often mentioned. She's the eldest child of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, and recently, as most of us know, she served 2 terms as Maryland's first lieutenant governor, and in 2002, she narrowly lost the bid for the first woman governor for Maryland. Ms. Townsend has made a national name for herself as an advocate of victims' rights and an innovator in the fight against crime. Before taking office as Lieutenant Governor, she served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the U.S. Department of Justice, during which she worked to establish community policing programs across the country. One of these programs, Police Corps, gives college scholarships to young people who pledge to work for police officers for 4 years after graduating. While in office, she served as chair of the Maryland Cabinet Council on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. As chair, she developed the first statewide initiative in the nation that targets crime hotspots. Former Attorney General Janet Reno praised this initiative as a national model. As Lieutenant Governor, she was also on the forefront of issues such as quality education and healthcare. Every step of the way, she has engaged citizens and remained focused on getting results. Ms. Townsend is the founder of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award, the former chair of the board of the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Foundation, and serves on the board of directors of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. She is also president of Operation Respects, a nationwide character education program that teaches right from wrong and personal and social responsibility. She currently serves as an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University School of Public Policy. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to turn this on. Does that work? Can you hear me? No. Okay, well, then I'm going to stay at the podium. I'm really just totally thrilled to be here. Now you can hear me. You're so lucky. But I want to first thank the president for telling everybody that he would vote for me. I'm deeply grateful. Thank you very, very much. We did work together. He was a wonderful provost at the University of Maryland, and you're very, very lucky to steal him away here in Iowa. So you're doing a terrific job. And this is I have to tell you, a very special evening for me for a number of reasons, one of which that I'm very lucky to be back in Iowa. As you probably can guess, a member of my family comes here every 4 years. So it's nice to be here in an off-year election. But actually, one of those years I came with, my Uncle Teddy was running for president in 1980, and I brought my daughter, who was then 6 weeks old, and I was nursing her, but I wanted to win. So I tried to juggle work and family here in Iowa, and I brought my daughter, who was at that point 6 weeks, so I could nurse her every morning and evening. And she told me to say hi to Iowa again. She actually called me when I arrived on the soil here in Iowa. The other reason I'm happy is that one of my great heroes in my life is here tonight, Michael Gartner, who I just think is one of the most fabulous people. And can you stand up, Michael? Because everybody should know what a wonderful person he is. He's chair of your Board of Regents. And he's great to talk to. And he's really fascinating and challenging, and I think I just really like him a lot, as you can tell. And the other reason I'm happy is one of the things that you didn't mention is I'm starting to work at Lehman Brothers, and my great aide-de-camp at Lehman Brothers actually is from Iowa, and her mother is getting her graduate degree here at Iowa State. So Mary, will you stand up, because it's nice to have a student who is the mother of somebody. We believe in mothers. Oh, there she is. There she is. Yay. She's also a teaching assistant, so clap loudly if you're in her class. And thank you, Diane, who picked me up at the airport and got me here and has set up a wonderful opportunity for me to talk about something that I really love, which is politics and women and what we can do. This is a very exciting time. I think if you think about what's going on in the world, the 21st century, it seems to me, is a marvelous moment and can be a marvelous moment for women. It can be the century of the woman. The last month, I thought, was so exciting to see a woman being elected, the president of Chile. You think of that was terrific. A woman was elected president of Liberia and Africa. First time that's ever happened. A woman was elected prime minister of Germany. And I was just invited yesterday to the inauguration of the first woman prime minister in Jamaica. So it's very exciting. That's the good news. We have a ways to go. I think we only have 11 women presidents out of 193 in the world, so we have a ways to go. And in the United States, we have one on television. And she did win a Golden Globe. But clearly, I think all of us are here in the hopes that we will do more than just win on television, but that we can win here in this country. And that's the great challenge. If we look at politics, you mentioned, Diane, all the women who are running this year. Clearly, when I was here in 1980, there were not as many women doing well in politics as there are today. We've got 67 women in Congress, we have 14 women in the Senate, and there are 8 women governors. So that's the good news, and that's very exciting. And I remember when it was different. In 1991, for instance, there were 4 women lieutenant governors, and the year that I ran, there were 21. It was a quick turnaround. So politics and the acceptance of women can change quickly. But the fact is, there's a question as to really what's going on in the United States and whether we are hitting a plateau. Because after 9/11, the number of women in statewide offices actually went down. We went down from 28% to 25%. And in large part, I think we went down because our belief of what a woman leader is, or what a leader looks like, changed. It was easy in the 90s when we were having big economic growth to see women being recruited into firms, doing well in law, doing well in business, doing well in politics, because our vision of what a woman leader looked like was of somebody who could get the job done, had good communication skills, was good at teamwork. But when we looked and thought of ourselves as being at war, our vision of what a leader looked differently, and we thought we needed somebody who was militaristic, somebody who was strong in defense, somebody who could stand up. And therefore we elected. Actually, we didn't really elect, but he got to be president. And he stayed president because he was reelected, in large part because that was an image of what leadership is. And and in fact, that's happened not just in politics, but really in the world, in other parts of the economy. If you think of law, 10 years ago, 13% of the partners in major law firms were women. And if you looked at the trajectory, we should be much further, but this year we were only 17%. So we didn't climb very much. Over 10 years to grow by 3% is not very much. Half the people in the workforce now are women, and yet only 8 CEOs are heads of the Fortune 500 companies. And there are 90 Fortune 5 companies which have no women officers at all. None. Zero. Zip. So that's not a positive. If you look at what happens to women when they go into the workforce, 47% drop out, get on what is called the off-ramp, twice as many as men. And if you look at morning talk shows, those Sunday talk shows, which is supposed to be the great leaders, the great thinkers of the country, only 14% of the guests on those talk shows are women. And 56% of the time, there are no women at all. So the question before all of us is the glass half empty or half full? And part of the answer, I believe, has to do with what women themselves demand and want. Because the studies have shown, and the statistics have shown, and my own experience has been, that one of the real challenges to women succeeding and to women being leaders is women. What do we want for ourselves? What do we think is good for ourselves? And why and how do we judge other women who are trying to achieve? When Hillary Clinton, for instance, ran for the Senate, one of the biggest stumbling blocks was women who stayed at home. And when I looked at my own numbers of my own campaign, I found the same thing, because there are women who are suspicious of other women. They're making choices that I didn't make. In fact, there's this woman running for senator from Minnesota this year said, recalls how a number of the women said to her, "How can you run for office? Why aren't you staying home and taking care of your kids like I did?" So we've got a challenge. And part of that means that we women have to find within ourselves a way to articulate our ambition and to make it clear that we can be leaders and that we have to gather other women in that process. So what I'd like to do, because I think that that's one of the challenges that Hillary Clinton clearly faces. She would be a great president. She's smart, She's knowledgeable. She knows what's going on. Michael Gartner reminds me that Governor Vilsack might also run for president, so I should remember where I'm standing as I speak tonight. But the fact is, and he is a great guy, and he's been a terrific governor, so I want to underscore that. But I think if we're talking about women, she would be fabulous, but she faces some challenges, which is, when you look at what happens when how the Republicans are going to get against her. You remember what Karl Rove said, she's angry. Now, what is the last thing people want? An angry woman. I mean, it's so different. When I was growing up, I remember when my father was running for president, he used to quote, was part of his stump speech, and on the walls of the pyramids, there was a saying that said, and no one was angry enough to speak out. And he was trying to stir up the country and saying there's injustice in this country. We have to be angry. We have to awaken to what's going on. And yet, what are they doing against Hillary Clinton? They're saying she's angry. And then you see David Brooks, New York Times columnist, wrote a column about her and how she had, this is about the Dubai ports, she put down her pitchfork. Well, somebody told me tonight that their relatives, Mr. Gallup, was in the Salem witch trials. What a relative to claim. But the point is, it reminds me of the pitchfork and the witch. The witches are putting down their pitchforks. These are terms, these are images that we're painting about women. So we, in this audience, and we are in part of the women's studies and are thoughtful about women, have to say to ourselves, how do we fight that prejudice? How do we create a different myth about who we can become? And what I'd like to, and one of those issues, very frankly, is to deal with the idea that women can be ambitious, they can want great things, that they can go for the stars. And that's really a challenge. I remember when I was lieutenant governor, I had a young woman come and be an intern for me. She was very smart, very bright. She was going on to Columbia, not bright enough to go to Iowa State, but she was going to do well. And she, at the end of the summer, she had been working for me. She was going to go to Columbia and major in political science. So I said to her, hey, well, are you going to get involved in politics? And she said, oh, no, that would be too ambitious. And we've got to teach young women, and all of us women, to be ambitious. And this isn't just true with her. I spoke to a group of Harvard students, and I wanted them to get involved in politics. And they said, oh, it's too difficult, it's too tough. And part of what we have to say is life is tough. Get involved, get engaged. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience of how I think, on the one hand, we have to set our ambition, and the other hand, we have to change the culture that says we can be ambitious. As some of you may know, I grew up in a political family. Just I want to know how awake this group is. And when I was growing up, I had very successful people in my family. My uncle was president, my father was the attorney general, and other uncle was a senator from Massachusetts, and my other uncle had started the Peace Corps. So they were not doing so badly. But the women, but none of the women ran for political office. On the other hand, what the women do is also a little intimidating, having 11 children. So it was not like an easy choice. But so, although it was never clear to me that I would run for political office, it was always clear that I would get involved in some sort of political, public service, try to make a difference. And that came because that was a very strong message that I definitely heard from my family. For instance, when I was 4 years old and when other kids were being taken to the playgrounds where they could swing on the swings and play in the sandbox, my mother took me to the Senate Racket Committee hearings, where some of my first words were, I refuse to answer that question on the grounds it may tend to incriminate me. As I sat around the dinner table when other kids might be asked by their parents, how did you do today? My mother and father were saying, okay, we're going to make sure that each of you know current events. And of course, if you have a family of 11 children, it's really important where you sit at the dinner table. So, I'd always sit at my mother's right. I just had to read the front page. So you go around, you really had to know what was going on. And then, when we got to be 12, my parents thought you should know 3 current events. We were promoted to 3 current events. And then on Sunday, we were required to either do a report on somebody in history or recite a poem. It was a great family. My mother thought this was such a good idea. Actually, I have to tell you, my father thought we should be quizzed not only on current events, but on history. And so I'm going to see how you would do at our dinner table. So where was the Battle of Bunker Hill fought? Did somebody say Breeds Hill? You'd pass the test. But clearly, we were tested. And then my mother, of course, thought this was such a good idea that whenever she did the carpool, she insisted that all the people in the carpool recite current events. And you could hear them say, "Oh no, Mrs. Kennedy is driving. What happened today?" So there was this real sense you better get involved. But what I also learned was not just from my own immediate family, was from I got to the other thing is we would also write my grandmother letters, and she would when we were young, and she would always write. We'd send her our letter. My parents made us write them letters, and she'd write back. She'd send them back, redlined, correcting. I kid you not, spelling, grammar, and diction. So, I didn't actually have a really warm relationship with my grandmother when I was young. I didn't really think how lovely, that sweet grandmother. I don't know where that image came from. So when I got older, when she became 75, my grandmother started to slow down. So she was near, so we would spend our summers together, and she'd always like to take walks. She'd take 2-mile walks in the morning, and she'd take 2-mile walks in the afternoon. And one of the grandchildren were always recruited to walk with her, and so I was the oldest of all the grandchildren, so I often walked with Grandma. And it was interesting. I mean, I can tell you a lot of interesting stories, but really for this evening, because she'd walk, and then we'd talk about the history, and then she'd go up and she'd study her French and German lessons. And you know why she'd study her French and German lessons? Because she said, she did this till she was 94, she said, because you'll never know who will come to visit you, and you'll have to talk to them. That's what she would say. But the fact is, why she really studied them is because when she was in high school, she wanted to go to Wellesley College. And to get into Wellesley, you had to know 2 languages. And her father didn't let her go to Wellesley. He wanted her to go to a convent in France. So she never got to go to college. And this is a woman who raised very successful children. But till the age of 94, she was still studying her French and German records to prove she could have gotten into Wellesley if only her parents. And I think it's a funny story, but it's also a poignant story about how women's sense of self come not just from your children, but from what you do. And this is a woman who raised very successful children. But when I walked with her, all those walks, she often talked about her childhood, her interest in art, her interest in current events. She almost never mentioned her children. And I think that says something about where people's fulfillment comes from. Back to what she also, so she taught us that. She also taught, of great belief in God, which was when life's times tough. She went to church. In fact, she used to go to daily mass, which my mother thought was good for us, so we went every morning, 8 o'clock in the morning. I know this is a religious community, and I shouldn't say this, but all the other kids were sleeping. We were getting up to go to church every day of the week. And then my grandmother went twice on Sundays. So the other thing my parents taught, even though we weren't going to I wasn't going to necessarily run for political office, was to know what was going on and to not just know it at the dinner table, but to get involved. I remember when my father went down to Mississippi and was having the hearings on hunger, and he came back, and it was a spring day. It was it was about spring day. It was a warm Saturday, and he walked into our dining room, which, as you can imagine, was a lovely dining room, beautiful crystal chandelier, linen on the table, and said, "I've just come back from Mississippi, and I've met a family who lives in a room the size of this room, with children with stomach extended and because of hunger and with sores all over them. Do you know how lucky you are? Do you really know how lucky you are? You should do something for this country. So that was always a message of getting involved. And when one of the most extraordinary things I think about is that when my uncle John Kennedy died, on the day he was buried, my father wrote me a letter that said, "Dear Kathleen, as the oldest of the grandchildren, I think you understood that Jack was buried today. And you understood what happened. Be kind to John," which my cousin, and my brother Joe. Be kind to others and work hard for your country. Which is a stunning thing to be able to say when you could be bitter or sad or angry, to say, get involved, make a difference, help others. And so even though I wasn't told I was going to get involved in politics, there was a sense that you had to make a difference. And when I think about the ways you do that, you get young women to say they can make a difference, and you teach them they can do it. And then what I found as a woman, what I needed to do is not just rely on my family, but find friends who could help me. So that when I listened to my father give a speech once about how there was problems on an Indian reservation, it was my pal who said, "Kathleen, let's go. Let's go work on the Indian reservation," because it wasn't just going to come from me, it was friends who would say it, and friends who saw strengths in me that I didn't find in myself. And one of my big lessons of the evening, and actually somebody said this at the dinner, or before the dinner, she was thinking of running for office, but she didn't really think of doing it till 5 of her friends said, "You can do it." So some of the problems with women, if we don't find the strength in ourselves, get your friends to run for office. Because they want to, maybe, but they need you to push them. The other thing that's helpful to have is a lot of sort of guts and imagination. And I'll just tell you one story. When I was in college, I had a crush on my teacher. I know you're not supposed to do that, Mr. President. But he actually thought it was wrong. You know, I would say, "Don't you think we should meet more often?" I said, "Why?" I said, to discuss poetry or something. Anyway, he would have nothing to do with me, and also he had a girlfriend, which made it even more difficult. So I thought, well, I've got to do something about this. So I thought, we were reading a book called Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi. So I said, hey, well, why don't we build a raft and float down the Mississippi? So we did. And it was 12 feet by 24 feet, and we went from East Carroll Parish, we went from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, not so far from here, to East Carroll Parish, Louisiana, and we just celebrated our 32nd wedding anniversary. So imagination. Think outside the box if you want something. And the other thing that I found that is helpful in politics and to doing well is building relationships, working with people. And I'll just give you one example. When George Bush, the father, became president, somebody invited me to go to the White House, and I was having lunch with my pal, and he was writing his inaugural speech with Peggy Noonan. So I said, hello, how are you doing? And will you please appoint my opponent who I'd run against for Congress to a job so I could run for that seat? I figure you got to ask. But after I saw him, I sent him a T-shirt because I wanted him to remember the work I was doing, which was getting kids involved in community service. And this is a man who was about to become president, and he wrote me a handwritten thank you note. And the other day, so I thought it was pretty amazing. A person about to be president has time to write thank you notes. And then the other day, I can't admit that I acknowledge this relationship, but my cousin-in-law is actually the governor of California. And so I wanted him to do something for my children, my children's school. So I asked him, and then I got his assistant to help me send me something. And I wrote him a thank you note, and then I wrote the assistant a thank you note. And afterwards, I talked to a pal of mine who had been my assistant when I was lieutenant governor. I said, hey, did anybody ever thank you for all the work that you did? Because people ask me to do things all the time. And she's the person who actually did it, right? So I said, did anybody actually ever thank you in the 8 years that you were with me? She said, she thought about it, and she said, yep, one person, Senator Kennedy. So Grandma was really good at teaching about writing thank you notes. And part of this story is one of the things that we have to do in politics is write thank you notes, talk to people, listen to people, build relationships. So those are the good things about what you can do. There are challenges, particularly for women, which I wanted to tell you about, because it's not just running. There really are challenges. When I became a lawyer, I applied for a job. And I talked to a law firm, and I said, I would like to know about your depositions and what's going on. But I also would like to know if my child got sick, what would happen? And I asked all these questions, and at the end of the interview, I didn't get the job. And the one woman partner in the firm said, well, she kept asking about what happens with her children. That could be one of her priorities, but it couldn't be her first. So there was a sense that you could not have children and really care about them and work in the law firm. Now, that was 20 years ago, and it might have changed by now, but that was real discrimination. I also went and I applied to a legal services and asked them, I have 2 kids, can I work part-time? And the man said, no, we are a very professional organization, and you can't. You have to work full-time. And I said, yeah, but you're trying to help people, and you're trying to help women, and I think it'd be better to be flexible. And he said, no. 5 years later, he ran for Congress and became head of the Family Friendly Caucus. So he'd always walk down the other side of the street whenever he saw me coming, because I'd remind him of his bad past. But part of that is to say, things change. When I ran for Congress, I kept being asked about raising my kids. When I ran 6 years later, when all the 94 and the women won, nobody asked that kind of questions. So part of the culture has to change. But part of that culture requires women to change. And it means that when women get positions of power, they have to alter the power structure, not just fit in to what's going on. And I'll give you 2 examples that I did as lieutenant governor. When I was lieutenant governor, the governor I was with was really focused on what are traditionally women's issues, education and the environment. So I took on crime and economic development. And we did a lot of anti-crime work. Michael Gartner pointed out, I was not in charge of crime, I was in charge of anti-crime. So we did that. But I also wanted to make sure, because we had women legislators and women judges, that we would focus on women in the prison system that nobody had ever focused on before. And we were talking earlier that traditionally, if you're going to be the anti-crime candidate, or the anti-crime governor or the leader, you wouldn't focus on women in the prisons. It's not a sexy issue. Nobody cares about it. You never hear about it. But if you're a woman and you have a position of power, you have a particular responsibility to take on those issues and start opening people's eyes, even though it might not be popular to the prison officials who have enough, they say, to do with all the men. We wanted to take on women. The same when I was doing economic development. We did a lot on making sure that we started the first manufacturing plant, finally opening again in Maryland in 20 years, and biotech industry. But I wanted to make sure that we would have conferences on juggling work and family so that we had answers to that. I focused on, and this goes back to the crime, domestic violence, but I realized that businesses, you could do a lot if you were going to focus on domestic violence by training, the 911 operators so they answer the right way, and the police officers who do the arrest, and the police who go there, and the prosecutors. You could train all the people in the criminal justice system, but if you brought the person to trial, the jury, which is part of our great culture, would always vote not to convict. So you had to change the culture. And so what I did is make sure that I had heard, actually there was a good reason for this, that the head of human resources at Polaroid had found out that many women missed the Mondays because they had been beaten up over the weekend. And there had been a culture that said, you may wear dark glasses, you may wear long sleeve shirts in the summer. It's probably because you're trying to cover up something, like you've been beaten, but it's part of our culture. I don't care what you're doing. So they wouldn't say anything. And we tried to change that culture and say, you have a big business in finding out if somebody's been beaten. And so we did a 4-hour training of every state employee in Maryland, and we cut, just as they had at Polaroid, the lost days of the Mondays, the lost days. Polaroid saved millions of dollars by making sure that we were involved in each other's business in domestic violence, and we in the state of Maryland tried to do the same thing. If I hadn't been a woman focused on this, it wouldn't have happened. And what we've seen, there's this new study out describing what women are interested in. And it's women who go to work, what they're interested in. It's very interesting. I'm going to give you 7 top things. Number 1, they're interested in good at work, good colleagues. 2, they're interested in being themselves. 3, they want meaningful work. 4, they want to make a difference. 5, they want to be able to juggle work and family. 6, they want some recognition. And 7, they want to earn money. Those are all very nice things, and probably you can relate to them. But none of those things are saying, I want to change the world. None of them are saying, I want to blast through and make things different. They're all kind of safe. They're lovely, but they're not backbone crunching, taking risks, ambition to change the world. And right now, that's what we need. We've got real challenges in our country, and we've got challenges around the world because the leadership in this country is not doing a good job. And they're not going to be able to they're not going to do a good job unless we have a constituency that says we've got to change. And that's right. And part of it means not just saying we want to be safe. Part of it is saying, I want gutsy, tough women and men who are going to take on the powers that be. And I like that. And I think it's good to feel uncomfortable. And I think it's important to say, what's wrong? Because I grew up in a family that said it's okay to be angry. You got to speak out. It's not just enough to be nice and good and get along. And part of the problem is that for women, is that what we have always been taught is to be nice girls, to be sweet, to be lovely, to keep our mouths shut. And it won't work. It just won't work. It particularly won't work now. And there's a fear of women, obviously. I mean, I think a lot of the issues that have been coming up recently are a fear of women, the backlash against women. The saying that if you look at the conservative talk shows, the women have too much power, women who have destroyed us, or women who have hurt us. And I think rather than just step back and try to do a good job, because what happens with women, which is very wonderful in an education setting, I will write a really good paper, I will study harder, I will try my best, is not the way to change history. The way to change history is to go out on the barricades. And right now, that's what we need. We need people to fight, to be articulate, and to make sure that they're really saying what's going on. So we've got to change our view of what it is to be a good woman. So close your eyes. and think of the old view of a good woman. Somebody who's nice and sweet and lovely. And now your new view of a good woman. What's your new view? Somebody who's tough and uncomfortable and tells you the truth. And that's going to be very tough, because all we've seen in the workforce and in politics is we don't want to be challenged. And what we have to say to each of ourselves, we have to learn to challenge others, and we have to get comfortable with being challenged. And that's the only way we're going to make the changes that are needed today. A friend of mine, and this is going to happen in politics, and it's also going to happen in the workforce. Let me just tell you about a friend of mine who's just written a fabulous new book. It's called 85 Broads. She was on Wall Street. She worked for Goldman Sachs. The address was 85 Broad Street, right? And she said, they're not promoting women, they're not taking women in, they're not being good to women. I'm going to start a women's group. And she did Women in Finance, 85, and she called it 85 Broads. She's written this new book called More Than 85 Broads, telling the stories of women who have taken charge of their career, who are saying we can make a difference, and we can do it in all sorts of different ways. You can read it, and you can buy it. She's my pal. I have to support my friends. That's one of the first things we do. Remember, support your friends. Because if we don't do that, we're going to be stuck here in 20 years and 30 years. And women are going to be still taking care of the families, taking care of their parents, wondering how they're not doing a good job of juggling work and family, being told you're not being a real woman or a good woman. And the world where kids are dying of hunger, where we're not having health care for our families, where we're not having good jobs for our citizens, are not getting the kind of America they need. So here I am at the Cat Center, started by a woman who followed Susan B. Anthony. Hallelujah. Here I am giving a lecture for a woman who was the first Republican. Can you believe I'm giving this lecture? And yet, she was pro-choice, worked for Planned Parenthood, was at the end of her life not given credentials at the Republican National at the Republican Convention because of her positions. So the world can get worse. I said at the beginning of this talk that this can be the 21st century could be the year of the women, and it can be around the world. But this country is the strongest, most powerful nation on earth, and if we don't take charge, the world will be at lost. As Susan B. Anthony said, failure is impossible. Let's get fighting. Let's get going. Let's elect women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for that powerful message. We do have a bit of time for questions, and I see Professor Hutter's already at the mic.
Last 2 weeks they told me I shouldn't be the last person. So
Exactly. Okay. But please, I'm going to announce two things. We'll take questions, and then at some point we'll need to cut them off so she can get her ride back, not with me, but to Des Moines. But I also want to tell you that there is a lovely table of food over there. Powerful instead of lovely, probably. A powerful table of food that you can also partake in. But anyway, we'll start off with Professor Hutter's question, but do feel free to have refreshments as well. So, Professor Hutter?
Yes, ma'am. I brought many of my students with me tonight. They're in here. We just got out of an introductory American government class where the topic was Congress. And I asked them a question I'll ask you. Why do we care if there are more women in Congress or not? Women are for sure the least represented, the most underrepresented compared to blacks or Hispanics or anything you want, with the possible exception of young people. But the question is, so what? Are there differences between men and women? And I asked them to take a vote. And the females in the class voted no. And the males in the class voted yes. I think that one of the problems that you need to address, that women need to address, is to make the case to women. There are reasons why we need women in Congress, not just we're half the population and underrepresented, but there will be a change. So I'd like to suggest you address that.
Thank you. I love these great questions. The more women you have, the more time Congress spends on issues that are of really interest to women. It was the fact that you had more women, you could get the Federal Medical Leave Act passed, which allowed people to take time off to take care of a child, a sick child, or a parent. That did not happen when you had a male-dominated Congress. You had, I'll tell you, in Maryland, because I talked about women in the prison system, that came because we had women judges and women legislators. We had no focus on women 30 years ago because it was all run by men. Until 19, I'm not going to get the dates correctly, but till about 1991, all the tests that NIH did were on men. Heart disease, liver disease, whatever, on men. And it took Susan Blumenthal and a woman in Congress saying, hello, women have different bodies than men. We have different cycles. I mean, I don't know if you don't know that. To say we're the same, we don't. We're not always the same. We have different health needs. And you need to do different tests. So you could go down time after time. We live longer. We make the decisions about who takes care of the parents. So that, for instance, if you were talking to a group of women who are probably 50 to 60 years old, one of the biggest issues I bet they will talk about is taking care of their elderly parents. This is not an issue that most of the men are going to be talking about. But elder care is a huge issue. So, Professor, that was a good question. And I hope after my answer that it will be clear. I mean, it's just time and again. It doesn't make it as much a difference to elect one legislator who's a woman. You need power. You need numbers. You need feeling that you can work together. One of my, one of the more interesting tales was a story. I'm going to, in the interest of being bipartisan, it's hard, but I'm doing it. Lynn Martin, who was a Republican congresswoman from Illinois, described how when she first went to Congress, her interest had been in education and health. That was her background. She went to Congress and she took on national defense because she thought she was one of the first women to Congress. She had to show that she could do anything, that women could do everything. And then she became the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and she got a little back to where she wanted. After she left Congress, she wore her dangling earrings and her long flowing skirts and was the person who she felt was her. But as a first woman, she made sacrifices in her interest and her desire in order to break the class ceiling for women. The fact that there are more women means that women who are interested in national defense can do national defense. Women who want to do education can do education. Women who want to do health can do health. It gives you many more options. But to say that women and men are the same and their interests the same, their experience is not the same. The fact is, how can you say that's the same when you have 8 women who are head of the Fortune 500? They're not getting to be the heads of corporations. They're not to be the partners in law firms. They're not on the talk shows discussing those issues. And usually when they do get on it's absolutely, we have different experiences. And, I had 4 children, not my husband. So I want birthing centers, and I want nice rooms, and I want maternity leave, and I want time off. I'm happy to have his help. Yes.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming to Iowa State. I've heard you mention that you work for a finance company to help recruit new women leaders. One of the things that I have a hard time justifying is women being hired just for the sole reason that they're women instead of their qualifications. I would prefer to be hired for my qualifications even if that means that I would lose out on a job to a man.
Right.
I was just wondering your thoughts on that, and if you could elaborate.
Sure. Women are really qualified. But what you learn is that people tend to think that people are qualified who look like them. That's who people tend to think, oh, he's good because there was a great story actually in the paper the other day. I think it was the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, about guy who just became head of a large corporation, and he was looking for fellow board members, and he thought, oh, I'll choose my people from my golf club. Okay, they may play golf well, they may be nice to have a drink with, but that doesn't mean they're qualified. It means they're his friends. And one of the deals in the world is people think that people who look like them, come from the same ethnic background, had the same experiences, are smart like them. It's very hard, and I know that Iowa State is now looking at developing a cultural center to overcome those prejudices and think that people who have had different experiences are just as smart. And they are. And it takes an effort to open up the door and say, oh, just because she doesn't speak English as well as I do, because she grew up in India or Pakistan or Tokyo, doesn't mean they're not good. But if you have a world in which you think everybody looks like you, then it doesn't work. So the real challenges in finance is to open up the doors to people who don't just look like you. The second issue, very frankly, is the world is changing, and what these people who all hired people who look like themselves are learning is their new clients are in China and India and Japan and South America. And so if you're going to be a really good firm, you better be diverse.
Good evening. I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer.
Oh, let me tell you a great story on that. Oh, sorry. Let me just, on this issue. So I did this conference about, hiring women. And one woman told the story of how she was the top salesperson in her firm. And the guy who was her boss said, well, now you have to come to Monday Night Football. And she said, I don't really like to go to Monday Night Football. I have a family. And he said, well, that's how we make our sales. And she said, actually, I'm the top salesperson without it. And he wanted to fire her because she wasn't doing what he thought was needed. I'm serious. There's story after story about what is qualified.
I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer.
Oh, good. What country were you in?
I was in Lesotho and Mali. I was
great.
in 2 different stints, and it was always incredibly refreshing to see that when I went to both those countries, the individuals, the ratio for men and women, the women easily outnumbered the men.
In the Peace Corps.
Right. And that was over a decade ago, and I met some wonderful individuals that had great, great, great goals and aspirations.
Right.
And they come back, and they get rooted, and they swallow through the cracks, and they're not doing what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
And I always thought a Peace Corps was a great model for
Right.
if you were going to have women step forth,
Right.
because after what they've seen in these third world countries, going to Washington,
Right.
D.C. should be a piece of cake.
Yeah.
What is the gap? I mean, why is it that you have so many individuals that have such great aspirations and more every day, and yet we're losing them? And I guess that's my question.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, you're talking to a mother of a Peace Corps volunteer. So my daughter was in Mozambique. So I'll ask her. I think the real answer is people, and this is a really good question. Women want to do good, which is the Peace Corps. But politics is power, and that's not good. The Peace Corps can be pure. It can be selfless. And politics is seen as wanting power. So obviously you're not as good. And one of the problems is that we faced, I think, over the last 20 years, and I think the Republicans have done this brilliantly, is to say government is terrible. Politics is dirty. Don't get involved. So it becomes an ugly place to be. So if you get involved in politics, of course you're going to be dirty. So you take the good people who would have been in the Peace Corps who wanted to do good, thinking they're going to join nonprofits, NGOs, but they're not going to go into government or politics. And at the time when I was growing up, I was taught, as you can imagine, that politics was an honorable profession. It was a way you solved problems. The government was a place that you made your most solemn, common decisions. It was a place that you worked together. There was a commonweal, a common good. And what we've faced, I think, over the last 20, 30 years is what I call as a privatization. You do good yourself. You might do charity. You might help somebody else. You might help to teach in the Peace Corps, but you don't go on and become part of power. And that's why I hope I talked about power tonight. Yeah. Yes? And that's the question, is for women to understand, and men too who want to do good, that they can use power, that it's a fair thing to do. Go ahead. Let's go ahead, and we can ask the next question.
Well, I think one of the earth-shaking things that's coming is to see the truth. Like the difference between true wealth and false wealth, where true wealth is what we all are working toward, which is happiness and freedom and security, and
right,
just good,
right,
good whole things, health. And false wealth is all based on money. And to me, women have a greater link to what true wealth is, taking care of their family and the nourishing thing, or making things better.
Yeah.
And you do it even if you don't have money. You go around the system.
Right.
And men seem to think that power is money, and money is the standard, and that's the economy, and it's all in the numbers, and it doesn't mean anything. So my great hope is that by getting more women in leadership roles, that the truth will come out.
It might. It's not necessary. It has to come. First of all, I don't like. That may be the dichotomy, but it's not a good dichotomy, because the fact is, I could take care of my family, but I can take care of a lot more families when I get to be governor or lieutenant governor and change the healthcare system and say that we're going to cover every child. So but that takes power. It's not just taking care of my own family. You've got to say, I'm willing to run for office, I'm going to raise money, I'm going to work with people, I'm going to hang out with people who, maybe I wouldn't want to have dinner with, but you know what? We're going to get something done. And what I'm trying to say, what I am saying is that's what has to be our goal. Very frankly, you can have women who win and don't have those goals. So what I'm asking you is to get power and do it for the good, and think of the common good, and believe in politics and believe in government, and not think that all things are going to be answered by fixing up your own private life or just joining a nonprofit.
And I believe that. I think that that's what we need.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So, who are you going to support? It's okay.
I would support, just to expand the consciousness so that we can work together rather than keep hitting our heads against the wall.
Well, that sounds. Thank you.
Because that's where the real power is.
Great.
Not in being right, or not in being the one that does it, but to be the one that influences it.
Doing it helps. Don't not doing it. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I come from India, and my question is that when I was in India, the condition of women in India is obviously has not advanced as it is in the Western countries, and that is something that I saw my entire life there till the time I was in India. And I used to look at the Western world with a feeling of admiration and envy that there are people in the world who are far more wise than we are, and we need to catch up with those people. And in fact, we had a women prime minister
Yes.
in our country, Indira Gandhi. She
Of
was,
course.
the prime minister
Yes.
for many, many years.
Yes.
And when I come here, I see that even here, there is a conscious debate over whether or not a woman should be elected as the president.
Right.
And the very thought surprises me, because when the Western world has taken so much lead
Right.
in the gender question,
Right.
why should there be a conscious question as to
Right.
whether or not there should be a woman president? And why is this paradox there?
Well,
Because
I
that's
think
my question.
I think there's a paradox in this country in particular, because our myths are not women myths. You know, if you think of the founding myths of this country, some of them are the cowboy, the frontier, the Davy Crockett's, the great captains of industry. So the image in our minds of leadership in America are very male-oriented. Versus, for instance, and our God is male. Particularly Protestant God is male. Whereas in the Catholics, which is, some of the Spanish countries, you've elected, you have all these saints that are women. So we have different visions. The same is true in India. Your myths are more, they're not all male myths. You also have female myths. And they were prime ministers. They were elected not just the leader of the country, so you have a different election. And then you have places like England where you had queens. But we have not had that. So our myths, and we haven't had the queens, so it's been harder for us to think of women as leaders. It's just not part of our consciousness in the way it could emerge in other countries. That's really what I think is going on. And so we have to reformulate we have to rethink it's kind of hard to say we have to rethink our myths, but, I'll give you what I think is a very sort of telling example. When you think of Ronald Reagan, who used to talk about the city on the hill, the great John Winthrop idea that we're creating something that all will see, it was, we're the best and everybody else should look to us. But if you looked at what John Winthrop actually said, he said, we should care about each other. We should love one another. We should care for the least among us. But that part of the myth gets forgotten. So we have to, what you traditionally do is you have to rewrite what's gone on. I love that you're smiling. And remember parts of our history that have been forgotten. And erect, which is the Cat Center does. We're thinking of Mrs. Cat. So that we think of different heroes in our past, and that's part of our past. But very frankly, that's not what we've heard about very much. And so we have to do that. And and it'll be easier to elect a woman if we see it comes from who we are. That was kind of a heavy answer. Well, I think that this has been a wonderful conversation with you. I love that the students have been coming and that we have all ages, because I think the real question is how we can change our own, Hillary Clinton can do a fabulous job. She can be terrific. But the culture has to open itself to women. It means the myths have to change. It's what we think of our education system, our workforce system, our legal system. All of that has to change, because that helps too. And all of that works together. It's not one thing or the other. And so it means the conversations we have, what we tell each other, what we tell, most importantly, ourselves. This is really, our leaders are a reflection of what we think the good is. And I think the good comes from men and women. We've got to give women a chance. With this audience, we will. Thank you very much.
All for coming, and please do partake in the reception in the corner.
Thank you.